Why don't we just say the three refuges together to begin? I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. I take refuge in the Sangha. So, what I wanted to talk about this morning are the Four Noble Truths. In particular, how we cultivate the Four Noble Truths. When I chose this as a topic, I felt I was maybe being a little pretentious, and that how can one say anything original about the Four Noble Truths? It's one of the Buddha's earliest teachings, been emphasized, down the centuries. How I want us to look at it, or not look at the Four Noble Truths, not as sequential, but as a whole. Okay, if you will, kind of four quadrants of a circle that we need to develop and cultivate each of the four quadrants. And the Buddha himself said, speaking of original teachings, he said that he just rediscovered these truths. They were ancient, universal truths that hold true, and he just rediscovered them and offered them to us, to the world again. So hopefully I'm in good company if I present something that has been said before or is familiar to you. But I hope I'll offer you a couple fresh looks. The inspiration for this talk came when I was visiting another temple recently. And I was also in Europe last year at some of our temples there. And what I'm often struck by is the different ways that we monks teach the Dharma. Particularly those of us who are Reverend Master Jiu's disciples. It's as if she kind of took herself and when she died and handed out different parts to different monks and said, you develop this part, you develop that part, da-da-da. That's kind of a gruesome metaphor. But the other way I like to think about it, which is a lot nicer, is think of it as a kaleidoscope. Because she was incredibly kaleidoscopic in her teaching, but also in those that she drew to her. We're all very different. We have many different backgrounds, and so if you think of it as a kaleidoscope, when we took the kaleidoscope apart, all the crystals were spread out, and they're all different shapes and colors and sizes, and yet they are all part of a whole. The thing that came up for me when I was at this other temple was something the Buddha said in response to questions about, well, what do you teach? He was always being bugged by people. Well, so-and-so says such and such, and what do you say? So-and-so says there's a creator. Do you believe in a creator? Is there a soul? It was a very active time in the Buddha's land that he lived in India at the time. There were many spiritual teachers, so he's often having to kind of clarify what he was teaching and how it was different than what other teachers were presenting. But one time he said, I teach only two things. I teach suffering and the end of suffering. Okay? Just those two simple things. I teach suffering and the end of suffering. And as I reflected on that, I was reminded of something that I think it was Reverend Master Daisui said, but I'm not sure. I remember it in my mind with him, but it may not have been original, but I'll credit to him at least, and hope I don't offend anyone else. But he said that people are drawn to training in kind of two different ways. Some of us are pushed into training by suffering. Okay, that can be emotional suffering, physical suffering, psychological suffering, spiritual suffering. We're pushed It's almost like we're driven, because we're hurting. Okay? Other people are pulled into training. There's something that attracts us. Now that's a generalization, and it may not hold true for everyone, and that's where I'm actually going to, that's kind of the next step in this. But we start with just that kind of dichotomy of suffering and the end of suffering. And so as I reflected on it, I realized, well, I'm not sure that's complete. I think that we can divide each of those. And when we divide each of those, we end up with the Four Noble Truths. And so that's what I want us to explore. How we're drawn to the teaching and how, regardless of which area we're drawn to and which area we first cultivate, we've got to cultivate all the other areas too in order to make a whole. There's something about the circle, the mandala form, that perhaps it's because of the moon. It's something that people have seen for, since the earth was created. So also there's something about the pupil of the eye. It's round. Those are the two perfect round things in nature. And so I think it just has something very profound about how we look at truth. And when we see like a quarter of a circle or 3/4 of a circle, our mind can't help but see the whole circle or see it as part of the whole. Likewise, even the moon, in its different phases, we see crescents, we see halves, but we always know it's part of a circle. That's why also it's often used as a symbol of the Buddha nature. Because regardless of how much you can see, all of it is there. The Buddha used very common items to explain things. He spoke in parables. He used things that people would understand. For instance, in the parable of the herbs from the Lotus Scripture, he talked about rain coming down and watering everything equally, and the plants grow up in different sizes. He talked about mustard seeds. Everyone knew what mustard seed was, common spice. He talked about lotuses. Apparently, it was a very common flower in India. Anywhere where you had standing water, you probably had a lotus blooming. And again, it had a lot of levels of meaning to it that he could use you could extrapolate and explain things. And these were things that people would continue to see in their daily life and remember the Dharma, help them remember the Dharma. One of the things that he used in explaining the Four Noble Truths, and it may be where he got the idea, was that the Four Noble Truths, as we understand them, that was the typical diagnostic procedure for the medicine of the time. It's called Ayurvedic. India had a very ancient medical system, just like China did. It was based more on harmonizing elements rather than trying to fix something, but very ancient and very well developed even by the time of the Buddha. You would go to the physician and you would say, "I'm suffering." Okay, the first step was to recognize the disease. Okay, why are you suffering? Or first label the disease. I am suffering. Okay, and then once you kind of know what it is, then you can go to the second step and, well, what's the cause of this? Okay, that's why, I guess doctors, nurses go to medical school so they can recognize the diseases. They can recognize what's wrong with people when they present themselves. And then the third step was, well, is there a cure? Okay. There's something about us as humans, I think it's all life. We want to live. There's always the hope that we'll live. We don't go to the doctor and told we have cancer and we immediately kind of give up life. Was there a cure for this? You think about this. Even spiders, you try to catch a spider in your room and it runs from you, it wants to live. There's something about us that wants life. And then the fourth step was medicine. Well, what can I do about this? And so the physician would prescribe a treatment or medicine or whatever. And you can see right there you have the Four Noble Truths outlined. Just going from a medical model, then the Buddha took it as a spiritual model. We have suffering. Okay, well, what's the cause of the suffering? Okay, he identified that as craving. Okay, you could say just selfishness. Okay, is there a possibility of a cure? Well, fortunately, in the spiritual realm, yes, there's a cure for everyone. Okay, there's always a cure. And then the prescription was what we call the Eightfold Path, the steps. This is what you have to do to achieve the cure. Okay? So first, let's talk about suffering. The Buddha didn't say that everything is suffering. He simply said suffering exists. Okay, that suffering is inherent in existence. Okay, that's one of the things I like about Buddhism. It's realistic. It looks at things straight on, and not through a filter. Suffering is universal. We all know it, even if it's, in the word that's used for suffering, even if it's just kind of uneasiness, dissatisfaction. It's translated lots of different ways. Some teachers translate it as simply uncertainty or stress. Okay, so it has the whole range of meaning, something that is unsettled, out of harmony, if you will. And some people come to training through suffering. They're really pushed by their suffering. We had some Vietnamese female monks visiting a while back, and they were really interested. The thing that they were really interested in, because they're trying to learn about the West and how to teach people, in the West. Or some of them were from Vietnam, so they wanted to know kind of what's working over here, and they're really fascinated by Westerners who practice Buddhism, because most of them began practicing, when they were 9 or 10 or maybe 18 or, very, very young. And so we went around the room and all of the monks told kind of how they came to training. And most of us said, well, I was suffering. I was unhappy. I was suffering. And so I think that's, as I said, that's one way that people come to training, is suffering. But again, I think we can split that into two and say, well, some people I think come because they see the cause of suffering. Okay. That's more, my experience. We're going along and we're doing life and we don't know we're suffering. And then all of a sudden we have an abrupt recognition of the cause of suffering, what we've been doing. One of my favorite films is called Protagonist. It's not everyone's cup of tea. I think it's very creative, but it's helpful to know that it's set as the steps of a Greek drama, according to a Greek dramatist named Euripides. And so it's the lives of 4 men, and you look at them in the context of this Greek tragedy and how their lives follow the same steps that they used in a Greek tragedy. And then it's very creative in that they have a Greek chorus that's part of a Greek tragedy. A group of people come on and comment on what's going on. And then they also have a very creative set for, to remind you of Athens and Greece and the Parthenon, and to remind you that this is the Greek chorus coming on and commenting. So there's these 4 men, and what I like about it, and they're extreme. There's no, question that they're on the extreme. But what I find helpful is that it shows how karma can get started in childhood, very early, and then just keep rolling and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And with each of them, they're rolling that ball pretty big, and then they hit something and they recognize the suffering that they've been causing. They don't realize they're suffering until all of a sudden they see what they've been doing. They see the consequences to other people, and they turn around. It's a conversion stories. Another good example is, from Buddhist history, is King Ashoka. He was the greatest Buddhist emperor. I think he had the largest Indian empire in the history of India. He started out as a pretty mean person. He was called Chandasoka, which meant delighting in cruelty, delighting in pain. He was known for building this torture chamber that on the outside it looked like a palace, but you went inside it, it was literally hell. He didn't have the idea, but his architect did, of imitating the Buddhist hells that some of you may be familiar with, all the different tortures that you see depicted sometimes. So it was really terrible. He killed his brothers to attain the throne. Not a very nice guy. Shortly after he became emperor, he went after a small country called, the people were called the Kalingas. It was just a small country. It had been a part of the empire when his grandfather was emperor. So Ashoka was kind of like, I'm going to get this back. And so he went on this campaign, and some historians say it was the greatest battle ever fought in India. The number of people killed. 100,000 people of his soldiers, 100 to 150,000 of the Kalingas, another group of people, that number deported. It was really awful. But the legend is that he encounters a woman who says, because of you, I've lost my husband. I've lost my father. I've lost my son. And he saw what he had done. It was just that small thing that turned him around. He became known as, again, the greatest Buddhist emperor. He began implementing Buddhist teachings, values in his empire. All sorts of things, advocating nonviolence, providing medical care for animals, for hospitals, and he became known as Ashoka, which means without sorrow. Okay, the A is like in English the A, not atypical, asymmetrical. Ashoka, without sorrow. And there's a film about that too, which it's a Bollywood film, and so it has a lot of singing and dancing. Okay. But it's really good, and they elaborate on the story quite a bit. It's quite imaginative, but you get the point. And unfortunately, it ends with the conversion, so you don't see the good that he did. But it's delightful film, and it really brings out the, again, pretty imaginative development of this person and how he progressed and then how he turned. So there's suffering, there's the cause of suffering. Some people come in, one of those two ways. But then on the other side, some people are pulled into suffering. I think some people, again, this was my experience, we're drawn by something positive. Okay, we see something that gives us hope. Okay, the Buddha saw a mendicant monk. Okay, that was, said that was a heavenly messenger. Each of us comes to practice because something gives us hope. We're pulled to something. Some people see just a kind act, that they see a better answer. They may not recognize that in one sense we're all suffering. They may not recognize that they have suffering in their life. In fact, they may have a pretty good life. but they see something better, and they're pulled into the Dharma. I think within this category, some of us are drawn to a teacher. Some of us see someone that speaks to our heart, and we go, I'm going to follow that person. I want to learn with that person. This is, I think, both monks and lay people. I'm not talking just about monks. I want what she has. I want what he has. And I think we can be drawn in, into that quadrant, start cultivating that quadrant. But I think we have to quickly go on to the other quadrants. It seems to be that while meditation is essential and foundational, knowing that there is something greater, we quickly have to figure out how do we realize that. We have to clarify what that is. Okay. And usually it's a matter of peeling away what we think it is, okay, and learning in more detail and what that really is. And so, what do? We start practicing, which is the fourth noble truth. We quickly move in, hopefully quickly, maybe not. Took me a while, but we move into the practice. Okay? And that's where we get into the fourth noble truth, what's called the Eightfold Path. Another thing that, again, I think it was Reverend Master Daisu, he would say that people are usually drawn to practice, either or drawn to the Dharma, either by the teacher, or they were drawn by the practice. Okay, and I know as I've talked with at least monks about this, that seems to have a lot of truth. Some are drawn to the teacher. Maybe drawn to the teacher, but then you have to learn the practice. Okay. For some of us, it wouldn't have mattered what Reverend Master Jiu taught. If she'd been a Sufi, well, we would have adopted Sufi practice because it was her and what we saw in her. And we wanted to learn from her and how she got to where she was. Some people, on the other hand, are drawn to the practice. They just recognize this is a good way to live. This is the right way to live. And those people, though, have to develop a relationship with the master, with the teacher. And it may not be a formal relationship. It may be that you just look at, Shasta Abbey as where you go for teaching. But we need that human element, and we need someone to help us understand what the teaching is. Again, to kind of clarify what does it actually mean? What does this actually look like in practice? The Buddha outlined as this fourth step is the practice, what we call the Eightfold Path. And people write whole books about that, so I'm not going to talk very much about the Eightfold Path. But again, something to think about. Instead of looking at it sequentially, which is usually the way it's presented, again, look at it kind of as a whole, as a spatial. Yeah, it's another mandala. And again, the Buddha was using something that everybody would understand, a wheel. It's usually depicted by a wheel. It's usually a chariot wheel. Well, who rides in the chariot? Well, it's usually the monarch. Okay, so by using that kind of wheel, you show people this is how you can be truly noble. He would explain that if you really want to be a Brahmin, like the holy people, it's not being born in a certain caste, it's how you act. And he could show in the same way, well, if you want to be truly noble, this is how you live. Live by the Eightfold Path. And that's the noble. Again, there is the nobility. He was from the nobility himself. And it simply means worthy, excellent. So it's the excellent path. in one way, as I was thinking about this, it's almost like the Eightfold Path drops out of the Four Noble Truths and creates another mandala. So you begin to get dimension. Okay, hold that picture in your mind. But coming back to not looking at it linearly or sequentially, what seems to be what we find in our practice, at least in meditation practice, is that we're working on we work on these different spokes. Each of the right thought, right speech, we don't take them in the order that they're usually given, but we work on this one for a little bit, and then we work on that one for a little bit, and then we work on our livelihood for a little bit, and then something arises in our practice in our lives. We work on right thought, right meditation, right concentration, and so we're continually working to strengthen all these spokes. Okay. And if you know about wheels, if you have a weak spoke, every time you lose one of the spokes, it weakens the wheel. So you need to have all of them for it to be strong. Otherwise, you hit a big rock, that wheel's going to collapse. So we want to be working on all these different spokes. If not simultaneously, quickly after one another. I think there's always one we can be working on. And when I talk about working on them, I think it's not like getting a book and kind of studying them in detail, but just look at your own life and reflect on them. What is right thought? What is right speech? And yes, there's some teachings about each one that can be helpful, but you're not going to find the answers laid out for you for every situation. The right in this is not right as opposed to wrong. Okay, right speech, right thought, etc. It comes out really more as correct, but that has problems in our modern day too, because the right thing may not be politically correct. It's right in the sense from what's right from meditation. Okay. I used to use the word when I first started Buddhism, appropriate, to try to get away from the, right and wrong, dualistic. The Chinese use a word that has all kinds of meanings. Straight, upright, even the character shows you how to be upright, exact, pure, fundamental, unbiased, etc. So you get the idea that it's not part of an opposite, but it's a whole. Okay? How do we do what's appropriate in a given situation? How do we, often I see it translated now as skillful. Okay? Skillful speech. What is skillful speech in this situation? What's going to lead to peace of heart for myself and for the other person? The word that's used for right, I've also seen it translated as wholesome, which doesn't quite work for me because, I don't know, it sounds like, flags and apple pie and, some kind of patriotism. We go to the county fair and, we're going to be wholesome. But the right, the sama, is it in Pali? It's the same word that's used when we talk about the Buddha as being fully perfected. Okay, so it's fully perfected thought, but we're always working on that. It's not perfect as that we have arrived. Okay, but it's the best. It's the appropriate. Okay, again, it's coming from meditation, not from a set of black and white standards. Okay. Okay. Holding all of that, I want us to look at another way of looking at the Four Noble Truths. looking at them more, I'm going to say Mahayana, more from the great vehicle. Mahayana, there's a problem with that word because it immediately brings up its opposite, which is Hinayana, which was a pejorative term at the time. Dogen uses that word in the sense that these are narrow-minded people. Okay? He's not talking about a specific school of Buddhism. He's talking about taking the teaching and not applying it in its broadest sense. Okay? Not including others in your practice. And, I don't think I've ever met a Buddhist who was not compassionate, regardless of what tradition they came out of. So I think it's a false dichotomy. Maybe modern scholars, they're trying to kind of put everything in pigeonholes, and they saw this as a convenient way to divide the teachings up and study them. We know from the reports of the Chinese monks who traveled to India that they would come across monasteries and there'd be Mahayana and Hinayana monks training in the same monastery. It wasn't really, an issue. But I think there's a way that, in Mahayana, in quotes, we do put more emphasis on compassion, at least kind of out front. I know it's there in all forms of Buddhism. Okay. But as Buddhism goes into new countries, as it develops over time, it finds different ways to express itself, depending on the culture, the time, the people. The Four Noble Truths really worked, for some people in India. As Buddhism developed, some people found it was more helpful to emphasize compassion. Compassion is part of the Four Noble Truths. It's the right view, the right speech, right thought is kind of interwoven in with all of them. But it came to be that some teachers, some people found it more helpful to emphasize compassion and training for everyone rather than just focusing on one's own enlightenment. And they never threw out the Four Noble Truths. Okay. The way I see it is, it's like, this shows my age. In school you would have, I guess it's what's called an overhead projector. You had this box with a light, in it and a clear top, and you could put something on it and then it would project onto the wall. And what you put on it was usually transparent in some way, so that you get a picture. Well, think of the Four Noble Truths as one of those pictures that you put down on the screen, on the projector that projects itself and shows a picture. The way I can look at this is that we take this other emphasis and we lay that on top of the Four Noble Truths. Okay, so it's an overlay. So it doesn't stand against it. But it's just an overlay. And if you think that there are no colors outside of the rainbow, okay, and what you get is a new blending of the colors rather than something different. Okay? You get purple where you've got red and blue. It's the same teachings, but they just appear differently with different colors. Okay? And so what I want us to do is take Dogen Shishogi, okay, and use that as our overlay that we're going to put over the Four Noble Truths and see how those relate. Okay? They don't match up exactly. Again, in the Shishogi you have 5 chapters, and the Four Noble Truths we only have 4. But it's really more like a fiber optic Christmas tree. I love those things. There's, a little thing of colors going around, and the tree is continually changing colors. Continually. I don't know if it ever repeats itself. But that's the way the Dharma is. It's alive. It's moving. Okay? It's not set for all time in a particular pattern. It's alive. It's responding to people's lives. It's responding to what's going on. Okay? So think of it, as moving fields of color, if you can, rather than just one, flat dimension. And I think this is an important point, that Great Master Dogen, he didn't buy this division between Mahayana and Hinayana. Okay? He would use Hinayana, but again, he used it for narrow-minded people. And he didn't even like the term Zen sect. He didn't like the idea of, in China, where they divided Zen up into 5 houses. He said, I just teach the Buddha Dharma. I just teach just the Buddha Dharma. It's all the Buddha Dharma. This is what I teach. He was even known as the old master of Buddha Dharma. It was a nickname that people gave him because he put so much emphasis on that. He was trying to not be sectarian. Okay? He was trying to give us the whole lot, just as the Buddha did. Okay, so let's overlay the Shishogi on the Four Noble Truths. The first two fit pretty well. The first Noble Truth is suffering, and the first chapter of the Shishogi is about impermanence. Okay, it's about suffering. Okay. The second Noble Truth is suffering's cause. And the second chapter of the Shishogi is about Sangha. Okay, about recognizing the cause of suffering and turning around. Remember those conversion stories I told you about the second Noble Truth, seeing suffering and turning around. Now in the Shishogi, the next thing that we come to is the precepts. And those really fit more with the fourth Noble Truth of the practice. Okay, as I said, this doesn't fit exactly. And then, there's the third Noble Truth in the, Nirvana exists. There's a cure. And for me, that still fits pretty closely with the fourth chapter of the Shishogi, which is awakening to the mind of the Bodhisattva. Okay. We develop the bodhicitta. We develop the seed of Buddha nature within ourselves. We have at least a kernel of faith in something greater that we're willing to do the practice. Okay? And yes, it sort of bleeds into the precepts and the other fields in this case. Maybe things are cross-pollinating, in their various fields. But it's a whole. So this is not a problem. Because the mind of the Bodhisattva and the instructions there are further teachings on how to practice compassion, tenderness, right speech, kind speech, benevolence, helping others. And so we filled out, the Four Noble Truths, and we've got one chapter of the Shishogi left over, the fifth chapter, which Dogen calls this is written. The Shishogi is all Dogen's words. He didn't put it together in this way. It was compiled from his different writings. Okay, but I think it's just brilliant, and Master Jiyu used it continually in teaching us about Buddhism and about the Dharma, because it really covers the span of what we're trying to do in our particular tradition. I sometimes see the criticism that the Shishogi doesn't contain anything about meditation. Well, if you look at the Shobogenzo, you could make the same criticism. The whole Shobogenzo, 95 chapters, it doesn't contain the rules for meditation. Okay. I think Dogen, and the teachers who compiled this, they're assuming you're doing meditation. Okay. This is just some teachings to reflect upon. They're not doctrine. Okay. If you just read this without meditation, it becomes sort of like a creed or a set of beliefs, and it's not that way. Okay, they're teachings to reflect upon, truths for us to actualize for ourselves. I think we have a problem with, I know I do, and at least used to, with the word doctrine. Many of us came out of religions where we don't, we're tired of the doctrine. We don't want any doctrine. But doctrine, it gets used in Buddhism, I think, because people with an Asian background don't realize the connotation it has for Westerners. Okay? But doctrine just means teaching. Now, we use the word teaching all the time. We use the word Dharma, which means teaching. We use truths. Okay? You could substitute doctrine, but immediately we begin to kind of squirm a little bit. At least I do. I think we equate doctrine with dogma. Okay, that's stuck. All right, that's frozen in all time, and there's a right and a wrong, and this is how it is, and you either believe or you don't, and you're in or you're out. Okay. The teachings that we have in Buddhism are for reflection. Okay, they're for reflection in the sense we take a few quiet moments and study these and say, how is this so? We take one of the steps of the Eightfold Path and just reflect on that during the day or during the week. Believe me, if you do, somehow the Cosmic Buddha will respond and show you. I find that way also with the precepts. You just take one precept and say, open your heart and say, I want to work on this precept this week. Well, it seems like the universe really rushes in to help you. Okay? And they don't stand against each other, so you can take a different precept every week, and you're learning the lot. But that's the way our teachings are. They're not. It's not a creed. It's statements of truth that people have realized, and they hold out to us with the challenge to realize them for ourselves. They're provable. I think the way the fifth chapter of the Shishogi fits into this, and it's called, again, the title is Putting the Teachings into Practice and Showing Gratitude. I think that includes the whole. Okay, it kind of sums up the other four chapters and then kind of gives us the whole. Well, what is it about? Well, it's about gratitude. It's about putting the teachings into practice. Okay, the Buddha himself said, well, if you would say, don't worship me. Okay, if you instead of worshiping me, practice the Dharma. That's how you honor me, by practicing the Dharma. Gratitude, practicing the Dharma. And then you get the whole. And so with each of these things, you get successive mandalas. You've got the Eightfold Path here on the bottom, you've got the Four Noble Truths, you've got the Shishogi, and then you've got kind of the whole. So again, it kind of gives it 3 dimensions. Okay? But then remember the fiber optic thing. It's always turning and moving and shifting. It goes up and down as well as around, and it's always moving. Okay, the Dharma is always moving. It's responding to our every moment. Okay, it's responding to our every need. Okay. So I just wanted to read a couple of paragraphs from this last chapter, because I think it kind of sums up what we've been talking about. It sums up how this is the whole. The Buddha said, Dogen wrote, "You need no further teachings than the above in order to show gratitude, and you must show it truly in the only real way, your daily life. Our daily life should be spent constantly in selfless activity with no waste of time whatsoever." Okay. Selfless activity. Okay. That takes us back to the second noble truth of what is the cause of suffering? What's selfishness? Okay. Some people try to, again, selflessness, that's kind of awkward and can be kind of scary. Well, I don't want to lose myself. Okay. But if you think about it, what is unselfish? I think it's a lot easier to figure out what the Buddha was talking about, and it gives one a lot more insight into what is good and right to do. What is unselfish in this situation? And then, again, just to kind of sum everything up, I think, the Shishogi ends with this really lovely image, which again kind of brings us back to the whole. He writes, "All the Buddhas are within the one Buddha Shakyamuni, and all the Buddhas of past, present, and future become Shakyamuni, Buddha, when they reach Buddhahood." And don't forget that each of us is Buddha too. This Buddha nature, again, that which we are awakening, this Buddha nature is itself the Buddha. And should you awaken to a completely understanding thereof, your gratitude to the Buddhas will know no bounds. So I'll close with that. Thank you.